Washington Talk, I'm Eun Jung-cho. 5 months after President Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un held a summit, Pyongyang has not taken any significant steps to give up its nuclear weapons and facilities. Even so, South Korea is eager to move ahead with inter-Korean economic cooperation. What is U.S. position on the two Koreas?
That we don't talk past each other, that we don't take an action or the South Koreans don't take an action.
In the studio with me today, Mr. Frank Jannuzi, president of the Mansfield Foundation and former advisor to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Also joining me today, Mr. David Maxwell, senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Mr. Maxwell is a retired U.S. Army Special Forces colonel with assignments in Korea. Welcome to the program.
Good morning.
Thank you. Good morning. Great to be here.
Now, North Korea canceled the high-level meeting with the United States, reportedly because it was getting angry at the United States for not lifting sanctions. So how is it on the U.S. side? How is U.S. feeling? Is it also getting angry at North Korea, or at least feel frustrated?
I think right now the United States is in patience mode, to be honest. Even though President Trump announced at the beginning of his administration that the era of strategic patience was over, I think the reality is more complicated. And now that they're on this diplomatic path, the United States is trying to push North Korea to make more meaningful steps toward denuclearization, including providing maybe an inventory of their nuclear facilities. And as long as the North is resisting these very concrete, serious steps, I think that the United States is content to apply pressure and wait. And maybe there's a miscalculation going on because the North Korean side also seems to be waiting.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think I agree with Frank, but of course we can't use strategic patience. But I think the administration is committed to negotiations. I think the problem is, and the frustration is that we haven't had working level talks. Stephen Biegun has not been able to meet with his counterpart, Chae Sun-hee. We don't know why. I wonder if perhaps Kim Jong-un is worried that professional negotiators may end up, not giving North Korea a good deal, and that he thinks that he can deal only with the Secretary of State and the President. And I think he needs to understand that that is not going to work. And I think also he might be surprised if he did come to the negotiating table. It did allow working level talks to occur, that he might see flexibility on the U.S.'s part. Mm-hmm. But I believe the U.S. will not give in to sanctions relief until negotiations occur and North Korea demonstrates sincerity in its stated desire, a willingness to give up its nuclear program.
Mm-hmm. North Korea canceled the high-level meeting because it thought that it would go nowhere, that it will not get what it wants, which is a sanctions relief. So what kind of flexibility are you talking about?
Well, first of all, I'd say that the U.S. is not going to give North Korea something for nothing, which North Korea has always demanded in the past. But I think that there could be not sanctions relief, but maybe waivers for certain sanctions to help South Korea to engage economically in the North. We know that Kim Jong-un has said that he wants to shift to economic development. I think everybody would support that as long as he demonstrates a sincere commitment to dismantling his nuclear program. Mm-hmm. And that's really the sticking point.
But if you're Kim Jong-un sitting in Pyongyang, I think that you may choose to look more to Donald Trump. And if you look at President Trump, this is a guy who tends to disregard the best advice of his intelligence community and his national security advisors and go with his gut. And so while David and I would want the president to get a good deal from Kim Jong-un, a deal that includes concrete steps toward denuclearization, I'm a little concerned that Kim Jong-un may have it exactly right, that President Trump at the end of the day is more concerned with the symbolism of a deal and the theatrics of a deal than he is with the substance of a deal. So why deal with Steve Biegun, who you know is going to be masterful in pursuing the details of actual denuclearization, if you can deal with Donald Trump, who might come to see you, shake hands, and make a commitment to ease sanctions and improve relations, and not get anything for it.
The summit, U.S. and North Korea summit were actually expected to be held within this year, but then it was delayed to early next year. So maybe President Trump is actually listening to his high-level officials that he shouldn't go into the second summit meeting unless there's some kind of progress in the working level.
I'm not sure that delay came from Trump's side. That may have come from Kim's side.
We should remember Kim Jong-un has a pretty full dance card. You know, another visit, perhaps with Xi Jinping, an invitation from Moscow, perhaps Abe. You know, he's extended an invitation to the Pope, and of course the visit to Seoul, which I think is going to occur before the end of the year. So that all may have pushed that back. But Frank makes an important point about Kim's assessment of President Trump. But I would push back a little bit on that. And I think Frank is exactly right, except that I think President Trump has history to look to. And one thing that I think President Trump never wants to be in the same position as any of his predecessors. And so I think he knows the past mistakes. His advisors have laid out the past mistakes that from Clinton, Bush, and Obama have all made. And so I think that he is not going to do something only symbolic. I mean, sure he did in Singapore. It was very symbolic. But I think he's not going to make that same mistake, those same mistakes in the long term. So I think Kim Jong-un may be miscalculating and incorrectly assessing the president.
I hope you're right.
So are U.S. officials looking for some kind of concrete evidence from the North Korean side that it is really going to give up its weapons? And what could that evidence be? Like start some working to dismantle the Yongbyon facility for one? What do you think?
Yongbyon would be a good start. Inspectors, any kind of beginning of the process that is really sincere. And I think, while I agree with Frank that dismantling of the nuclear program can't occur without a declaration, that may be a bridge too far initially for Kim Jong-un. Yes. He said that he doesn't want to turn over a target list to the United States, and that's certainly true. That information could be useful for targeting. But I think that to really demonstrate sincerity, he's going to have to allow inspectors to inspect some of the sites and start maybe on a small step-by-step basis. Certainly Pyongyang, inspectors there to assess what the test site is like. Sohae, the missile launch facility, even though it's not really a significant threat to the United States, those would be small steps. And how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. But he hasn't demonstrated anything on that scale. And everything that he has done has been merely symbolic, to include only returning 55 remains of perhaps some 200 that are ready for return.
IAEA this week said that North Korea's continuing activity at the Yongbyon site and also called for North Korea to invite the inspectors back in.
Yes.
So when do you think, Frank, should North Korea show these actions of sincerity? Should it come before the summit or can it come after the summit?
When you deal with North Korea, you often have to challenge yourself to think in sequence. And the North Koreans have an expression, action for action. And the United States, I think, needs to embrace the concept, even though we need to push hard for as many actions from the North as possible. So if we really want inspectors to come into Yongbyon and verify a suspension of activities there, we're going to have to be prepared to give something in return. And as David mentioned, I think the U.S. side is prepared in a limited way to look at the sanctions portfolio and on an action-for-action basis reward North Korea for concrete, real steps toward denuclearization. And I think it's the job of the working level talks. This is why those talks are so important. It's the job of Biegun and Chae Sung-hui to sequence and agree the sequence of action for action. That's really something that the high-level officials are not equipped to do. They don't have the right priority list and they don't know enough of the details. So My hope is that the working level talks can get going, and that the first step would be to invite inspectors into Yongbyon to verify a suspension of the activities there, the production of fissile material. And all of this could be agreed in advance, would be accompanied by some sort of reward, some sort of limited sanctions relief by the United States. And I think all of that, frankly, ought to happen before a second summit. I think moving into a second summit without any concrete steps on the ground would be a mistake.
I want to move on to South Korea. This week, U.S. and South Korea launched a working group, and Secretary Pompeo said that the two sides shouldn't talk past each other, and that progress in denuclearization shouldn't lag behind the inter-Korean cooperation. And the U.S. media put this as Secretary, saying a word of caution, indicating that he had been concerned. So, what is your take, David?
Yes, I think, first of all, I think the working group is very important. And one of the reasons why it's important is North Korea has already come out and attacked it. And has made statements that it is meddling in North-South relations. And to me, that's a very positive sign, because the working group has a great potential to prevent misunderstanding and to prevent North Korea from trying to split the ROK-US alliance. And so I think that this is a great move forward. Now, obviously, there has been, on the South side, a great push for improved North-South relations. The Comprehensive Military Agreement, the Pyongyang Declaration, all of these are really very aggressive steps towards trying to build trust with the North. I think the U.S. concern is, yes, it doesn't seem to be in sync between denuclearization and North-South relations. But I think what the U.S. concern is that South Korea may be, in the interest of trust building, giving up security in the South. And I think that's the real warning, if there was such a warning, which I think that's too strong a word. But I think that's where the real concern is on the U.S. side, is that the South will move too fast and reduce its security, because while we worry about the North Korea's nuclear program, their conventional threat remains, and they remain in an offensive posture. And if South Korean defenses are weakened because of trust building, it really puts South Korea at risk.
I worked for the State Department for 9 years, and so let me give you a little translation of Diplo speak. When the Secretary of State says that he's confident that the U.S. and South Korea are going to move together and that North-South relations will not get too far ahead of denuclearization, what he's really saying is, actually, he's kind of worried that the South is getting out front. So what you've got here is a situation where the United States is increasingly concerned that North-South progress is outpacing denuclearization. And I think that the U.S. has no intention of reining in the South, but that the U.S. is getting more and more anxious to get some progress on denuclearization.
Now, after the talk, South Korea said that U.S. showed strong support on relinking the inter-Korean railways, whereas the State Department said nothing about that, even upon inquiries from the media. So why is the difference of the interpretation of what the two sides had discussed?
Well, I think President Moon Jae-in needs to show some progress for his own domestic popularity, and the U.S., frankly, is not going to be that impressed by those kinds of steps. And even if they are true, the U.S. is not going to highlight that as the kind of progress that Washington is looking for in the denuclearization and peace process.
The railways, are not going to be significant, I think, from a U.S. perspective. They're not going to be a threat. They're really not going to do much, especially because of differences in the rail systems between North and South. It's really symbolic. But what I think is important is Secretary Mattis making the statement of scaling back the full legal exercise in the spring. And to me, that is demonstrating support for diplomacy, as he said, as well as for South Korea's position as well. So, I think this is another indication of U.S. flexibility to try to support diplomacy. President Trump had suspended Ulchi Freedom Guardian in August. And this is one of the things that, for decades, North Korea has used as an indication of U.S. hostile policy, the exercises.
Head of CIA's Korea mission team, Andrew Kim, was in Seoul from November 14th to the 17th. Is this a prelude? Is this a sign that there's going to be a high-level meeting between U.S. and North Korea soon, like at the end of this month?
Who knows? I don't know. I do know that the coordination of our assessments of the North is very important. We need to get on the same page about whether their economy is growing or shrinking, whether their nuclear activities are being curtailed or proceeding at pace. And I think that I'm encouraged to see the depth of the integration of U.S. and ROK assessment teams really trying to be on the same page about North Korea.
Mm-hmm. We'll have to end it here and move on to our next topic. And let's watch video for our next topic.
China's taken advantage of the United States for many, many years, and those days are over.
The U.S. and China are in the midst of a widening trade war. This comes at a time when North Korea continues to solidify its relations with its friends. Now, how is the trade dispute impacting China's cooperation in North Korea issues with the United States?
I think Washington would love for China to separate completely their cooperation on North Korean issues with the trade dispute, but I think that's not really the way Beijing works. When Beijing thinks about the United States, they tend to integrate all the different aspects of the relationship, from trade to human rights to security interests. So right now, the trade tension, I think, is certainly affecting China's overall mood about coordinating with the United States on North Korea policy. But at the end of the day, China does not want a nuclear-armed North Korea, and they don't want instability on the Korean Peninsula. So I think they're going to continue to work with the United States toward peace and denuclearization, but that coordination just became more difficult with the escalating trade war. And the willingness of China in particular to join with the U.S. on any new pressure tactics, I think, has been greatly diminished by the tension that they're facing now on trade. Anything that's going to cost China financially is going to be a step that they're going to be very reluctant to take.
I also think that I agree with everything Frank said, although I've heard from other Chinese scholars that China may be willing to try to compartmentalize in order to have some area of cooperation with the United States. So I would hold out some hope for that. But I do agree. I think Frank is right in his overall assessment. But in terms of lifting sanctions, I think there's another thing that we need to be concerned about. And Frank mentioned this with instability. China's concerned with instability. And I think that if China pushes hard to reduce sanctions, it's not only for its own financial benefit, it may be an indication of its assessment of how internal instability may be progressing inside North Korea, and their belief that they need to reduce sanctions in order for Kim Jong-un to remain in power and to be a stable leader. So I think we have to assess that from that perspective as well.
Mm-hmm. So do you think China will push even further to ease sanctions on North Korea if there is progress in the denuclearization talks?
Well, I think that's its preference. I think that they are happy to make concessions based on the word of Kim Jong-un, and China, just like Kim Jong-un, needs to understand that the United States is not going to make concessions based solely on words, and so they really need to get on board with how the United States is thinking, and that it's not going to make the same mistakes that it's made in the past.
No, I think David's got it just right, and the Chinese view their economic relationship with North Korea as leverage over North Korea. So from their perspective, the sanctions reduce their influence, easing sanctions increases their influence, and so they would prefer to be moving in that direction. China doesn't want to be frozen out of the future of the Korean Peninsula. They want to be deeply involved in helping to have influence over the future of the entire peninsula, north and south.
David mentioned about instability within North Korea, and this week North Korean media actually said the Arab pro-democracy movement was actually an Arab winter because of it calls a tragedy continues in that area. Why do you think North Korea said this week, and what is its biggest fear?
Well, I think that's the question. Who does it fear more, the United States or its own people? And I think when we hear propaganda, in media reports in North Korea along these lines, we can make an assessment that perhaps they are seeing, rising tension among the population, among its second-tier leadership. Potential for economic and political resistance may be there, and this may be a way to tamp that down. And so, while we often think about North Korean media as simply propaganda, there are often messages and indicators that we can draw from that. And so my concern is that maybe the North is concerned with its own instability internally and the problems that might be occurring within the population.
I think David is touching on one of the real fundamental issues that has become an obstacle to denuclearization. If the North were truly confident that openness and integration with the international community would be 100% beneficial for them, they would have denuclearized a long time ago, because the nuclear program has cost them dear in terms of sanctions and international isolation. But the truth is more complex. North Korea actually thrives under a certain amount of isolation and insulation from the pressures of democracy and the market and global information flow. So for them to integrate themselves and denuclearize is a mixed blessing. And we're seeing some evidence of that concern, I think, voiced by their propaganda machinery now.
And denuclearization can lead to delegitimization, and they've really backed themselves into a corner, putting the fact that they're a nuclear power in their constitution, putting so much emphasis on that. And this really has caused them to, to realize that even though opening would be so beneficial to them, and they would get so much international assistance to help them develop economically, at the same time, that would potentially undermine the regime's legitimacy and could cause real problems for the regime. So this is the paradox or the irony that North Korea has built in its own regime.
So I think it really boils down to Kim Jong-un's strategic choice that he has to make.
That is.
Indeed. Does he have the confidence that he can master this process of integration and sanctions relief and normalization, or does he fear that that itself will lead to pressures that would undermine his regime and his own position as the leader?
And that strategic choice can lead to a brighter future for the Korean people living in the North. Does he really want that? And I think the Korean people living in the North have a right to demand that from their leadership.
On that note, we'll move on to our next segment. Now time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today we have a picture of a Korean war hero, General Baek Sun-yup, on a wheelchair here, congratulated on his 99th birthday by U.S. Ambassador to Korea, Harry Harris. The U.S. 8th Army held a surprise party for the celebrated general. The new commander of U.S. Forces Korea, General Robert Abrams, told General Baek, "You are like the foundation of the U.S.-Korea alliance." General Baek is best known for making an important contribution to the defense of the Busan perimeter early in the Korean War. David, what's your reaction?
Well, General Baek is a true hero, a true Korean hero, but also a hero of the alliance. I've been fortunate and honored to meet him many times and hear him speak about his defense commanding the 1st Infantry Division on June 25th, 1950, and his exploits throughout the Korean War as a real leader. And he's probably one of the last living people to have stood side by side with General MacArthur. So his span of history, his breadth of history is enormous. He's a true Korean patriot, a hero of Korea, a defender of Korea, and somebody who we should honor and revere.
You know, we're only 2 weeks away, or 2 weeks past Veterans Day here in the United States, and so when I see photographs of such as this of those who gave so much in defense of freedom and democracy in the interest of their country, I just feel a great debt of gratitude to them for their struggles and what they fought for. And I'm reminded that the age of such heroes is passing, and we're entering a new age.
Frank, David, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Yun-jung.
And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun-jung Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.